Miss Marple and the Man Who Cried Wolf Once Too Often. Chapter 1. The Man by the Bridget. It's one of those peculiar spring mornings in Thistlebrook, the kind that begin with drizzle and end with golden sunlight, as if the weather itself couldn't decide on its mood. The hedges along Church Lane were just beginning to show their blossoms, while the postmistress, Mrs. Corbett, could be heard complaining about the damp affecting her ankles, as she did every April without fail. Life in Thistlebrook rolled along in dependable rhythms. The vicar's bicycle bell at 8:45, the clatter of milk bottles by 9 o'clock, and by 1:30. Most of the village had either sat down to tea or begun grumbling about the parish council. There was nothing in the air to suggest anything out of the ordinary except, perhaps, for the rather loud and unmistakable voice of Mr. Percival Moorcroft echoing across the meadows. "Help! Help! There's been a murder." He was standing on Mill Bridge, flapping his arms in wide, desperate arcs as though trying to signal an aircraft. A startled heron took flight from the reeds below, and a sheep bleated in what sounded almost like resignation. Mrs. Adelaide Henshaw, turning from the baker's with a warm loaf under her arm, did not break stride. "Another one, Percy," she said as she passed. "What is it this time? A dead ghost? Strangled shadow? It's real this time," Mr. Moorcroft cried. "You've got to believe me down by the river bank. I saw him. Blood everywhere," Mrs. Henshaw tutted, and continued on her way, muttering that man's been watching too many American films ever since he got that little transistor radio. And truly, few in Thistlebrook paid heed to Mr. Moorcroft's claims anymore. Over the past year alone, he had reported 12 burglaries, none real, 6 poisoning attempts, all meals he had cooked himself, and one sighting of a masked man with an axe which had turned out to be a Boy Scout with a walking stick and an ill-fitting scarf. The general consensus was that Percy Moorcroft was harmless, if exhausting, but on that particular morning, its fate chose not to reward the village's skepticism. At 9:27 a.m., Constable Edwin Rowntree arrived at the bridge, out of breath from cycling up the hill and looking more annoyed than alarmed. A ruddy-faced young man with a fondness for order and an aversion to paperwork. He had promised himself this would be the last time he humored old Moorcroft. "Where is it?" he asked, panting. "Down there by the hawthorn bush," Moorcroft said, pointing with a trembling finger. "I was walking to the green, and I saw someone's slumped. Night. Went closer and saw the blood. It's real this time, Constable. I swear it." Grudgingly, Constable Rowntree approached the edge of the bridge and peered down through the early morning mist. His eyes narrowed. Something pale and unmoving lay beneath the hawthorn, partially hidden by its overhanging branches. He climbed down the slope carefully, boots slipping once on the damp earth. When he reached the figure, he stopped dead in his tracks. The man was lying awkwardly, one leg bent beneath him, the other stretched toward the river. His shirt, once white, was soaked through with a dark stain over the chest. His face, partially turned away, was deathly pale. Rowntree bent down. No pulse, no breath. He straightened slowly, the air around him suddenly thick with something grim and heavy. Moorcroft, still hovering at the top of the bank, called out, "You see? I told you." Rowntree didn't answer at first. When he did, it was only to bark, "Don't come any closer. This is a crime scene now." By the time Miss Marple heard the news, it was nearly 10 o'clock. She had just finished her morning letter written in an immaculate hand on blue paper, scented faintly of lavender, and was watering the begonias by her kitchen window. The distant sound of a police whistle, sharp and urgent, caught her attention. She paused, tilting her head. Thistlebrook was not the sort of place that required whistles, let alone urgent ones, and if one was blown, it was never this early in the day. She placed the watering can gently on the windowsill and went to fetch her cardigan outside. The village had already begun to stir with with speculation. Mrs. Brimley, the butcher's wife, had caught wind of something dramatic at the bridge. Word traveled quickly in Thistlebrook, faster than milk and stronger than tea. Miss Marple walked at a steady pace through the village green, her steps sure, her eyes alert, but not obvious about it. She passed the post office, where two old women stood gossiping on the stoop, and arrived at Mill Bridge just as the constable was putting up a makeshift rope with the help of young Johnny Ellis. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple," said Rountree, stepping forward. "No one's allowed past. We've had, well, a situation." Miss Marple nodded. "So I gather Mr. Moorcroft found the body. Claims he just happened across it. And the man," Rountree glanced over his shoulder, "name's Roger Gallivant, new tenant at the Manor House East Wing. Not well liked, from what I've heard. Writer of some sort." "Was," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not is. Surely," Rountree hesitated. "No, I suppose not." Miss Marple stood quietly, taking in the scene. The damp grass underfoot, the hush of curious villagers kept at bay, the faint rustle of branches above the embankment. No one noticed her examining the footprints in the mud, nor the unusual angle of the man's head, nor the way one cuff button was missing. Behind her, the crowd began murmuring louder. "I knew something would happen with that man," said Mrs. Henshaw, "always arguing at the post office. Called me a clucking old hen. Once he owed money, didn't he?" added Mr. Ellery, the greengrocer. "To half the village, some say." Miss Marple listened, but only just. Most people revealed more by what they didn't say. And she had already learned to watch the eyes, not the mouths, as the villagers speculated and Constable Rountree summoned the inspector from Muchwood. Miss Marple turned her gaze once more to Mr. Percival Moorcroft. He was standing a little apart now, hands in pockets, trying successfully to look both innocent and important. Something in his bearing struck Miss Marple as ... off. Not grief, not shock, a kind of smug relief. A man who had cried wolf too many times, and now, finally, the wolf had come. But who had invited it in? And who would benefit most from the cry being true at last? Miss Marple turned, already forming the first quiet lines of a new pattern in her mind. Chapter 2. The Village Murmurs by Midday. Thistlebrook was no longer a sleepy hamlet, but a hive of speculation. The sound of raised voices and whispered suspicions drifted through the air like pollen. Curtains twitched, teacups clattered. In every shop, garden, and drawing room, the name Roger Gallivant was spoken with a mix of grim satisfaction and theatrical disbelief. At the Rose and Compass, Thistlebrook's sole public house, a cluster of locals gathered over lunch pints, talking in low, urgent tones. "Dead, is he?" muttered Harold Gubbins, polishing the rim of his tankard with a grease-smudged napkin. "Well, can't say I'm shocked. That man stirred more trouble in 6 months than a fox in a henhouse. He threatened to sue me," added Elsie Trigg, from the flower shop. "Over a daffodil arrangement, if you please. Said it triggered his hay fever intolerably." "And didn't he go after the vicar about bell-ringing hours?" piped up Ruby Long, who worked weekends at the post office, said the bells interfered with his creative process. Every voice seemed to offer a new grievance, a new minor feud, a new reason why the death of Roger Gallivant, though shocking, had an air of inevitability. He had arrived in Thistlebrook under the guise of solitude and inspiration, but quickly established himself as a thorn in everyone's side. He rented the east wing of the manor from Lady Eustace Fenwicke, Cana, distant widow of impeccable breeding, and failing memory claiming to be writing a novel. Though none ever saw him write, he did complain loudly, almost daily, about the noise, the food, the roads, the people, and even the birds. His manner was sharp, his temper shorter still. He made enemies with all the enthusiasm of a man playing a game he intended to win. By the time Inspector Lennox arrived from Muchwood at 2 o'clock, the crime scene was secure. and a crowd had already formed a semicircle near the bridge, held back only by Constable Rontrie's firm voice and occasional puffed cheeks. Lennox was a stocky man in his early 50s, with graying temples and a suspicious eye. His arrival did little to quell the village's interest. If anything, the presence of a proper inspector trenchcoat and out confirmed that something grave had indeed happened. Lennox surveyed the area with a brisk nod. "Body has been moved." "Sir," said Rontrie, "just roped it off. Good. Cause of death: single stab wound to the chest. No weapon found." Dr. Burnlaw confirmed time of death likely between 6 and 8 this morning. Lennox grunted. "Who found him?" "Mr. Percival Moorcroft." Lennox glanced over his shoulder to where Moorcroft lingered, still repeating the story of his horrifying discovery to anyone within earshot. "Moorcroft?" he asked flatly. "Yes, sir." "Wonderful," Lennox muttered. "Let's see what sort of mess he's made of things this time." Meanwhile, Miss Marple had returned home, not out of disinterest, but because she had already gathered more than most thought possible simply by observing. As she prepared a pot of fresh tea, she reviewed the details in her mind. Roger Gallivant, age early 40s, possibly younger, but made older by bitterness. No visible friends, no family in the area. In a small village like Thistlebrook, isolation was rarely accidental. She recalled seeing him twice, once shouting at a young boy for kicking a football too near the manor's gates, and another time speaking rudely to Mrs. Beadle at the greengrocer's because her strawberries were bruised and beneath contempt. He had not endeared himself, and in Thistlebrook, where social harmony was the oil that kept the wheels turning, a man like Gallivant created friction at every turn. But Miss Marple had noticed something else, something others might not see. On the morning of the murder, the bakery had sold out of milk rolls earlier than usual. Why? Because a woman in a green coat had purchased 6 in one go, a rare occurrence, a deliberate one, perhaps. And Dr. Brunley's cart had been seen leaving his cottage just after serving a full hour before he normally made rounds. Curious. That afternoon, she stopped by the vicarage under the pretext of returning a borrowed gardening book. Reverend Alice, ever polite and slightly distracted, ushered her into the study. "Terrible business," he murmured, pouring her a cup of weak tea. "Absolutely ghastly. You knew Mr. Gallivant, I believe?" she asked gently. The vicar cleared his throat. "Yes, well, knew is perhaps more accurate. He came to a few services, sat in the back, never sang, and left early. Complained once about the sermon being lacking in philosophical insight, which I took to mean not flattering enough to his ego." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You're not the only one he offended, I hear." The vicar gave a pained chuckle. "Deed not. He was a man who enjoyed being difficult. I suspect it made him feel important. And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "men like that rarely die without reason or witnesses." The vicar looked up sharply, but Miss Marple had already sipped her tea and turned her eyes to the garden view, as if remarking on the tulips back in the village. Inspector Lennox was busy interviewing Mr. Moorcroft. "You're sure you didn't touch the body?" "Of course not, Inspector." "Suspect beyond belief. And what were you doing out so early in the morning?" "Routine walk, Inspector. Doctor's orders keeps the lungs clear." "Even though your past morning walks have involved 3 false burglaries and 1 misidentified scarecrow." Moorcroft bristled. This was different. "I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the air." Lennox said noncommittally. "Did you see anyone else? Any movement in the trees?" "No, sir. Just the body and the blood." It was dreadful. Lennox made a note, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, Miss Marple wandered toward the green again, this time stopping at the small cottage of Miss Letitia Greenway, a woman known for her lace doilies, sharp tongue, and a private piano student. List that rivaled the telephone book in size. Roger Gallivant, Letitia said with a sniff. Wouldn't know Mozart if it bit him. Always pacing up and down the manor gardens, muttering into a tape recorder. Frightened my cat more than once. Did you see him recently? Miss Marple asked, eyes never leaving her knitting. Yesterday morning, shouting at Lady Phoenix's maid. Something about missing post. Thought he was going to burst a vein. Very red in the face. And the maid, Clara, quiet girl, good-natured, left crying. Poor thing. Miss Marple thanked her and walked away, her steps slow and thoughtful. The pieces were beginning to appear. Not yet a full picture, but edges were forming. A man no one liked. A maid in tears. A walk too early. A body too still. Yes, Thistlebrook was murmuring, but beneath the gossip. Miss Marple was beginning to hear something else. A pattern. And where there was pattern, there was motive, and likely a very real murderer hiding among the mundane. Chapter 3. Tears in timetables. Late afternoon sunbathe, Thistlebrook in a golden hue, softening the thatched rooftops and lending the cobbled lanes. A warm serenity that belied the undercurrent of unease running through the village. Though life continued, curtains washed, garden rows weeded. Letters delivered did so now, with cautious eyes and half-finished conversations. The murder of Roger Gallivant, and the fact that it had been real, had shaken the village's equilibrium. The center of this quiet storm, Miss Marple went about her day in a manner most would describe as ordinary. But those who had known her longer, particularly those who had underestimated her form, might have noticed the slightest sharpening of her gaze. The increased attentiveness to details no one else marked. It was nearing 5 when Miss Marple arrived at Thistlebrook Manor, a cream-colored structure with ivy-covered columns and the faded grandeur of old money stretched thin. Lady Eustace Fenwick, widow of a baronet and bearer of a surname far older than her roof tiles, answered the door herself, leaning heavily on a polished cane. Miss Marple, she said, her voice like dry silk. Do come in, you've heard. Of course. Ghastly business. Simply ghastly. I thought it best to pay my respects, Miss Marple said gently, and to ask after your housemaid. Clara, is it not? Lady Fenwick raised a thin brow. Clara, she's upstairs. Poor girl. Absolutely shattered. Such a delicate constitution. She found out just after breakfast and wept into the marmalade. I wouldn't dream of troubling her, Miss Marple said, stepping into the hallway. But if she's up to it later, sometimes young women find it easier to talk to. An old one, Lady Fenwick sighed. That man, Gallivant. I only let the east wing because the taxes were climbing higher than the lilacs. He was rude, of course, always complaining. I avoided him whenever possible, so he did seem to have a particular interest in Clara distasteful. Really? Miss Marple tilted her head. You think he was? Pursuing her, Lady Phoenix. Lips thinned, if you can call it that. Clara never said anything directly, but there was a look about her when he was in the room. Fearful, I'd say. May I ask? Miss Marple said casually, what was Clara's routine in the mornings? She rises at 6, bless her, and brings me tea by 1:30. Then she dusts, tends to the drawing room, and collects the post from the gate. Everything else varies, but those things are like clockwork. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And did Mr. Gallivant keep to a routine? Lady Fenwick gave a delicate snort. Okay, if you consider sulking in a dressing gown until noon a routine, then yes. Oh, he did begin walking in the garden at odd hours lately. I spotted him out near the hedge maze just after dawn last Thursday. Psst, muttering into that horrid little recorder of his. Miss Marple left the manor shortly after, thanking Lady Fenwick and promising to send a jar of quince jelly soon. She did not immediately head home, however. Instead, She made her way to the small house just beyond the bakery where Dr. Burnlaw lived. Dr. Simon Burnlaw was a man in his early 40s with a brisk manner and the disheveled charm of someone perpetually forgot he was wearing his stethoscope. He greeted Miss Marple with surprised politeness. "Miss Marple, come to check on your blood pressure or to interrogate me gently like you always do?" "Neither, dear," she replied with a small smile. "I'm just terribly interested in the timing of things." He opened the door wider. "Come in." It was just boiling water for tea. Inside, the doctor's study was cluttered in a comforting light, papers stacked with hopeful precision, books leaning against biscuit tins, and a cat asleep on a velvet cushion beside a tray of plasters. Miss Marple took her usual seat, the one near the bookshelf with the wobble. "I understand you were called to the scene around 9:30, she asked, after accepting a cup of Darjeeling. "Yes," Burnlaw said, sipping. "Runtree fetched me. I examined the body. Gallivant had been dead at least an hour, maybe more. A single clean stab wound. No hesitation, no struggle. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Okay? And yet the murder weapon is missing," Miss Marple noted. Burnlaw shrugged. "Probably taken. No blood trail, though." "Odd, Simon," she said gently. "I believe your buggy was seen leaving your house before 7 this morning. It's rather earlier than usual for you." "No," he blinked. "That's true. I had a call to see old Mrs. Eltham. She's back from her sister's in Devon and having trouble breathing again. I took a shortcut across the back lane." "Ah, that explains it. One does hear things, you see," she said, with the soft tone of someone who most definitely did hear things. They finished their tea in comfortable silence, till Miss Marple set her cup down and said, "Clara, the housemaid, is frightened, but I'm not yet certain of whom." "Gallivant, surely," Burnlaw replied. "He was a bully, preyed on people smaller than himself." "Yes, but if he frightened Clara, then she might know more than she realizes. And if someone knew she knew?" The doctor frowned. "You don't think she saw something?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that young women are often observant, even when no one expects them to be. And I think Clara may be far more important than anyone realizes." As she walked back through the village at dusk, the lamplighter making his rounds just behind her, Miss Marple passed Mrs. Henshaw on the green. "They say Gallivant was stabbed with something sharp and narrow," Mrs. Henshaw whispered conspiratorially. "My Harold thinks it was a gardener's shears. But I say, it was a carving knife." "Possibly," Miss Marple murmured, eyes flicking toward the manor on the hill, "though murder is rarely so practical." And as the shadows deepened across Thistlebrook, Miss Marple reflected on something her late brother used to say. "It's not the storm that breaks the tree. It's the rot underneath." She suspected the rot in Thistlebrook had gone undetected for quite some time, but it had surfaced now, in the form of a dead man by a bridge and a frightened maid who knew just a little too much. Chapter 4. Clara speaks in whispers. The following morning dawned over Thistlebrook with the hesitant clarity of early spring. Blue skies bruised by drifting clouds, a faint scent of damp earth, and bird song muffled by an air of subdued anxiety. Though the church bell rang as usual, and the baker displayed his jam tarts with practiced cheer, the village was not at peace. Roger Gallivant was still dead. And no one, not even Miss Marple, had the faintest idea who had killed him by breakfast. Gossip had reached a fever pitch. Theories buzzed like wasps in every sitting room. Some insisted it was a crime of passion. Others blamed tramps or vagrants, though none had ever been spotted in Thistlebrook. Mrs. Henshaw had even begun charting suspicious behavior in her garden diary, listing names of anyone who walked too briskly or looked too well-rested. Miss Marple, however, was not theorizing. She was preparing scones at precisely 11 o'clock. She packed a modest tea basket, complete with her best gooseberry preserve and a small envelope of lavender biscuits and, walked up to Thistlebrook Manor for a second time. Lady Fenwick was in the drawing room reading a French novel upside down and claiming it was too avant-garde to make immediate sense. "She's in the conservatory," the old woman said, gesturing vaguely with her cane. "Still pale as chalk. It's shaken her badly." Miss Marple found Clara by the geraniums, seated on a low bench with her hands clasped in her lap. She was a small, tidy creature of about 19, with neat auburn braids and the sort of face people often forgot quiet. It's unthreatening and slightly pinched at the corners. But her eyes, Miss Marple noticed at once, were not forgettable. They were sharp. Watchful Clara stood when she saw Miss Marple. "Ma'am, I didn't think." "No need to stand, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, placing the basket between. "Dim, I thought you might like some tea. Lady Fenwick says you've barely touched a thing since the news." Clara sat back down, the fabric of her skirt whispering against the bench. "It's very kind of you." Miss Marple poured out tea and handed her a scone on a small plate. "We don't need to talk about anything if you'd rather not, but sometimes a worry becomes smaller once you speak it aloud." Clara hesitated, then took the plate. Her hands trembled just enough to be noticed. "He frightened you, didn't he?" Miss Marple said softly. Clara nodded, almost imperceptibly. "He was strange. Mr. Gallivant. He had moods. He would be pleasant, charming, even then suddenly turn cold. Angry over nothing. I never knew which version I'd be speaking to." "Did he ever touch you?" "Oh, but he stood too close. Said things that didn't sound like compliments, but weren't quite insults either. It was like he enjoyed making me uncomfortable." "Did you ever consider telling Lady Fenwick?" "I didn't want to be dismissed. It's not easy to find work like this. She's been good to me otherwise." Miss Marple nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. Young working-class women in places like Thistlebrook were often expected to keep unpleasantness to themselves. Clara set down her teacup. But that morning, the one when he was found did see something. Miss Marple didn't lean forward or speak too quickly. She let the moment breathe. "I was coming back from the post box," Clara whispered. "It was early, just after 6. I like to collect it first thing. No one else was up. I was passing the side path by the orchard when I saw someone slip out of the east wing door." "Who?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clara hesitated. "I couldn't see clearly. It was still gray, and they had a dark coat on, hat pulled low. But the way they moved quick, like they didn't want to be seen. Male or female? I think male, but I can't be sure." "Did Mr. Gallivant have visitors?" "Not that I know of. He kept to himself, had groceries delivered, never said where he went on his long walks." Miss Marple absorbed the information without comment. A figure leaving Gallivant's rooms in the gray hour between sleep and sunrise. Detail, both subtle and explosive. "Did you tell the inspector?" she asked, double quotes. "No, I didn't know if it meant anything. I was scared. What if they think I did something wrong?" "I don't want trouble, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Truth is rarely troubling unless it's hidden too long." She rose slowly, gathering the empty cups. "One last thing, Clara. Have you ever heard of a woman in a green coat buying all the milk rolls from the bakery yesterday morning?" Clara blinked. "That might have been Mrs. Wintercombe. She's got house guests, I think, French relatives." Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. "Thank you. And Clara, if you remember anything else, anything at all, you'll come see me." Clara nodded. Miss Marple left her sitting there in the dappled morning light, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the windows, something remembered, or perhaps feared. On her way home, Miss Marple encountered Inspector Lennox on the green, standing with his notepad open and a scowl on his face. "Miss Marple," he greeted warily. "Should I be worried you're 2 steps ahead of me?" "I doubt it," she said politely. "So I did speak with Clara." His eyes narrowed. "Did she mention anything useful?" I expect she will, Miss Marple said, once she trusts herself to be heard. Lennox looked unconvinced. I've got no evidence, no weapon. It's just a man no one liked and too many villagers with bad memories and grudges. And that Moorcroft fellow's testimony is so dramatic, it might as well be a script. She saw someone leave the east wing that morning, Miss Marple said quietly, before the body was found. Lennox stared at her. Did she say who? No, but perhaps you should ask who had reason to visit Gallivant unannounced, and who feared being seen. The inspector closed his notebook. You have suspects? I have observations, she replied. Suspects tend to show themselves if you listen closely enough. Miss Marple turned down the lane toward her cottage. A cool breeze stirred the hawthorn hedges, shaking loose a few petals like confetti from some invisible celebration. But there was no celebration in Thistlebrook, only secrets, and one of them had killed a man. Chapter 5. The man who knew too little that Friday morning, as the village stirred with its usual blend of order and rumor. Miss Marple sat in her parlor sewing a small tear in her linen handkerchief. The needle moved steadily between her fingers, but her thoughts were not on the mending. They were drifting quietly, systematically through the figures in this unfolding play. Gallivant, Clara, Lady Fenwick, Inspector Lennox, and, now, quite unavoidably, Mr. Percival Moorcroft. He had not, until now, been part of Miss Marple's focused suspicions. But something about Clara's account had shifted the air slightly. A figure slipping out of the east wing in the early morning. A dark coat, a hat pulled low. If Mr. Moorcroft had been taking his routine walk at that same hour as he claimed, might he have seen something more than he let on? Or worse, might he have been the figure Clara saw? It's precisely 10 o'clock. Miss Marple rose, pinned her hat neatly in place, and walked to Chestnut Row, where Mr. Moorcroft lived in a narrow house cluttered with potted ferns and peeling wallpaper. He was in the garden, hunched over a patch of violets with a trowel, looking both satisfied and irritated, still unsure whether to be proud of the blooms or annoyed by their audacity to grow without permission. Miss Marple, he called, straightening up as she approached. Come to congratulate me on my discovery, have you? Miss Marple smiled gently. Something like that. May I come in? Oh, of course, of course. Mind the hose. It leaks rather vengefully. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and oiled wood. Stacks of crime novels and crossword books lined the shelves. On a side table sat a small crystal ashtray containing a burned matchsticks, strangely, neat in contrast with the rest of the disarray. I've had a most dramatic week, Moorcroft said, settling into a battered armchair. You know, when I saw that body, I thought I was hallucinating. Then I thought I might be dreaming, okay? Then I thought, well, finally, they'll have to believe me now. It must have been a dreadful shock, Miss Marple said, sitting across from him. You poor thing. He waved a hand, brushing away sympathy like a housefly. Oh, I've seen worse in my day. It's traveled a bit, you know. It's seen things in Cairo and Casablanca that would turn your hair white. Miss Marple did not correct him that her hair had been white for decades. You mentioned you were out walking when you found the body, she prompted. You're a man of routine, Mr. Moorcroft. Absolutely. Discipline keeps the mind sharp. 6:30 every morning, rain or shine. I do the same loop. Up Church Hill, past the Manor Gates, over Mill Bridge, down the lane to Bramble Hollow, then back through Greenway Orchard. It's 28 minutes, precisely. Did you see anyone that morning, apart from, well, the unfortunate discovery? Moorcroft squinted. No one I recognized. Not. But now that you mention it, okay, I did think I saw someone moving near the orchard hedge, a bit ahead of me. Just a shadow, really, but fast. Wearing a hat, perhaps, possibly. It was low light, but I remember the walk being unusually quiet. No bird song, and I'd heard something just before I saw the body. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. What kind of something? A splash, Moorcroft said, brows nodding. in the water below the bridge. Not loud, but definite. I thought maybe an otter or heron. K. But now, you'd think it could have been the murder weapon. It's thrown into the stream. Quite possible. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And you didn't tell the inspector? He said, fidgeting slightly. You know how they view me? After the incident with the supposed kidnapping and the chemist's exploding kettlewell, let's just say I've been relegated to the role of village eccentric. People often dismiss those who speak too much, Miss Marple said gently, even when they say something true. He looked at her gratefully. Exactly. You understand? I tried to. She paused, letting the silence draw out like thread on a needle. Tell me, Mr. Moorcroft, did you know Mr. Gallivant personally? Oh, well, I spoke to him once or twice in the post office. He had the sort of tone that implies everyone else is a minor inconvenience. Unpleasant man. Said my choice of novels was intellectually bankrupt. Can you believe it? And yet, she said thoughtfully, you were the one to find him. You were always the one to report things. Coincidence, Moorcroft insisted. I just happened to be more observant than most. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind lingered. Coincidences could be telling. She returned home just as Inspector Lennox knocked at her gate. He looked grim. We've just finished dragging the river, he said. Found a slim blade knife, 6 inches, wrapped in cloth. No fingerprints, of course, but blood, consistent with the wound, in time of death, between 6 and 7:30. Your housemaid friend might have seen the killer. She didn't say she saw him, Miss Marple corrected. Only that someone left the east wing. Still, it narrows things down. Gallivant was killed in his room. The wound was clean. No signs of forced entry, which means someone he knew or someone with a key. Miss Marple's eyes turned toward the manor. Lady Fenwick claims she never leaves her bedroom before 8. Says she's too stiff in the mornings, and Clara's alibi is thin, but she doesn't fit the crime. No motive, no opportunity. She didn't enter the east wing that morning. Miss Marple nodded slowly. We're not missing a piece, Inspector. We're looking at the wrong corner of the puzzle. Two. You mean, she said. We're assuming the killer came in to silence Gallivant. But what if he summoned them? What if he'd arranged a meeting? Lennox blinked. That would suggest Gallivant knew he was in danger. No, Miss Marple said quietly. It suggests Gallivant thought he was in control. She offered no more. Not yet. The pieces were there, lying flat like a pack of cards. She needed only to turn over the right one. Chapter 6. Secrets Beneath the Ivy. The days following Roger Gallivant's death passed with an odd sense of both quiet and tension in Thistlebrook. Light, the hush that comes just before a thunderstorm. The townspeople had begun returning to their routines, but there was something in the way they walked, spoke, or avoided one another that revealed a deeper discomfort. Thistlebrook was not a place that coped well with secrets, 'cause its entire existence was built upon the illusion that there were none. Miss Marple, however, had no such illusions. On Sunday afternoon, just after church and before the garden club's spring meeting, she returned to Thistlebrook Manor. Not with tea and scones this time, but with a book, The Language of Wildflowers, which she claimed she'd borrowed months ago. In truth, she had never read a page of it, but it served its purpose. Lady Fenwick received her in the drawing room, draped in shawls and sipping something that was likely stronger than tea Jane. She said, airily, You've returned with my long-lost volume. I'm quite touched. I thought you might like it back before summer, Miss Marple said. I know your gardener is terribly proud of those alpine forget-me-nots. He's more fussed with those than my rose beds, Lady Fenwick muttered. But I suppose men need their vanities. She gestured vaguely toward the armchair, and Miss Marple took her usual seat. Has your young maid recovered her nerves? Miss Marple asked after a moment. Clara, she's still like a shivering rabbit, Lady Fenwick said, setting her glass down with a sigh. Can't say I blame her, She adored order, and now, a man's died within yards of her daily sweeping. It unsettles girls like her. I imagine so, Miss Marple murmured. And yet, Mr. Galavant was not an easy man to adore. He seemed to take pride in unsettling everyone else. Lady Fenwick narrowed her eyes just slightly. You speak as though you suspect someone in this house, Jane. Not at all, said Miss Marple pleasantly. But I do wonder if someone in this house was more deeply involved in his affairs than we thought. Lady Fenwick was still. What do you mean? I believe Roger Galavant had leverage over someone, Miss Marple said, watching the older woman carefully. He wasn't well liked, but he wasn't just disagreeable. He was calculating. He collected people's weaknesses like other men collect stamps. Lady Fenwick's fingers tightened slightly on the arm of her chair. You know something? She said at last. Don't you? I know that Clara saw someone leave the East Wing before dawn, and I know Galavant wasn't expecting to die. He may have been blackmailing someone, and blackmailers make poor neighbors. There was a long pause. Then Lady Fenwick stood, slowly, and walked to the window. He came to me, she said quietly, 2 weeks ago, said he'd uncovered something about my late husband, about the estate. He didn't say what, but he hinted he had letters, documents, and did he? I don't know. He offered to stay quiet for a fee, said he needed funds to publish a memoir. Miss Marple folded her hands. And did you pay him? No. Lady Fenwick turned back, her voice brittle. I told him to go to hell. If people wish to rake up old gossip about my husband's affairs or finances, let them. I've lived through scandal before, but someone else may not have taken such a strong view, Miss Marple said. Lady Fenwick frowned. You think he was blackmailing more than one person? Miss Marple nodded. It's possible, likely even. He saw too much, spoke too little, of substance, and always made sure he left you wondering what he might say next. As she rose to leave, Lady Fenwick stopped her. Jane, what will you do? I shall knit, Miss Marple replied calmly, and wait for the truth to make a mistake. Outside, the air had turned crisp despite the sunshine, and the sound of sparrows filled the hedges. Miss Marple turned toward the village, her mind working as precisely as the gears in her long silent grandfather clock. If Galavant had been blackmailing Lady Fenwick, then surely he'd been doing the same to others. She had suspected it already, but now the motive was no longer general dislike. It was fear. Fear of what he knew. Fear of what he might reveal. That evening, she paid a short visit to Harold Gubbins, the local handyman who had once been fined for illegal betting, and now spent most of his time pretending he had never even seen a horse. Galavant, he said, when Miss Marple brought him up, never liked him. Always poking his nose about, asking questions he had no right to. What kind of questions? Asked me about Lady Fenwick's solicitor, if you can believe it. Asked about the church repairs. Even wanted to know if the vicar had gambling debts. I told him to bugger off. Pardon me. Miss Marple gave him a thin smile. Did he mention anything personal? Harold hesitated. Said he'd seen something. A letter addressed to me. Said he might ask the vicar about it. Thought he was bluffing, but made me nervous. What sort of letter? He cleared his throat. For my brother in Birmingham, years ago. I was well. I had a brief stint in a trade I don't discuss. Petty smuggling, before the war. And you thought Galavant had proof. I thought he wanted me to think that, Harold said, grimly. But maybe he did have something, okay? He was always scribbling, always looking. Miss Marple left Harold's cottage with the wind pulling at her sleeves and her thoughts churning. Okay, so Galavant had cast a wide net, dropped subtle threats, and waited. He'd cornered people without evidence, just the suggestion of it, and someone had finally called his bluff. Back home, she sat at her writing desk and opened a small, worn notebook. It contained no names, only a list of phrases. Clara, frightened. Green coat Mrs. Winter comb. Comb. Gallivant. No friends, but many listeners. Splash beneath bridge equals knife. Routine walk. Moorcroft. Letters. Blackmail. Beneath them all, she wrote one new line. He provoked someone into silence. She looked at the line a long while, then crossed it out. He provoked the wrong person into silence. Somewhere in Thistlebrook, the murderer was still smiling at neighbors, still tending hedges or pouring tea, thinking the secret safe now. That Gallivant was gone. But Miss Marple knew better. Secrets were like ivy. They crept, they spread, and eventually they cracked the stone beneath. Chapter 7. The second visitor on Monday morning. The post arrived late, which was unusual in Thistlebrook. Mrs. Corbett, the postmistress, blamed a mechanical fault at the sorting station in Muchwood and suggested it was likely sabotage by communists. The villagers, however, were less concerned with politics than with routine, and by the time the postboy had done his rounds, the delay was forgotten except by Miss Marple, who received a curious envelope with no return address. Envelope was thin, cream-colored, and sealed with a strange wax symbol to interlocking circles. Inside, she found only a single sheet of paper bearing 3 typed lines. He knew about the orchard. He had pictures. Adeem, want to be next. No name, no date. No handwriting. Miss Marple read the message twice, then again a third time, as she set the kettle to boil. She didn't need to be told what orchard the note referred to. There was only one in Thistlebrook proper, the old Greenway orchard, bordering the edge of the manor grounds and the path that led behind the vicarage, the same orchard that Mr. Moorcroft had claimed to pass during his early morning walk, the same orchard Clara had mentioned seeing someone near, and now pictures that changed everything by mid-morning. Miss Marple was walking briskly through the lower path behind the village, taking care to appear as though simply out for air. The orchard had not yet fully bloomed, its gnarled apple trees still waking from winter. The earth was soft underfoot, and the grass, still patchy in places, rustled as she passed. She took note of the fence partly broken near the southeast corner, and the old bench half buried under a veil of moss. Everything about the place whispered of secrets, but it was the impression of something hidden, not just physically, metaphorically, that struck her most. She spotted Constable Rowntree emerging from the north side, holding a small notebook. Miss Marple, he said, straightening at once. Out for a constitutional? Always clears the mind, she replied, and I hear minds are particularly taxed these days. Rowntree offered a weary smile. Inspector Lennox asked me to check the orchard for any traces Gallivant might have, left cigarette butts, footprints, notes. Nothing so far. Gallivant came here often, apparently. He'd sit on that bench, sometimes recording things into a little device, like a journalist. Lady Fenwick said she once saw him with binoculars. Binoculars, Miss Marple echoed. How delightfully theatrical. He fancied himself some sort of spy, Rowntree said. Could have been watching the manor or the vicarage. Just enjoying the feeling of power. Miss Marple considered this. Was there any indication of what he saw? Not yet. Lennox is checking his rooms again. His files, notebooks, that sort of thing. I do hope he doesn't overlook the trivial, she said softly. Beg pardon? Men like Gallivant rarely file things sensibly, but they're often predictable in one way. They hide things where they expect others won't look. The familiar, the domestic. Have you checked the kitchen? Rowntree blinked. I don't think so. Miss Marple gave a nod, as if that settled it. Do pass the suggestion along. As she made her way back toward the village, she passed Reverend Ellis, who was kneeling in the church garden with a spade in one hand and a particularly distressed expression on his face. Good morning, Vicar, Miss Marple called. Oh, Miss Marple. He stood quickly, brushing dirt from his knees. Terrible news, all of it. Dreadful. I hear you and Mr. Gallivant were not close. I tried to be charitable, he said, but the man was corrosive. He confronted me after service 3 weeks ago, said he knew about my loan. Miss Marple tilted her head. Loan? The vicar hesitated. Last year, during the restoration fund, I borrowed privately from someone in Muchwood, slightly irregular terms. I hadn't declared it formally to the council yet. Not illegal, Miss Marple said. No, but embarrassing if exposed. Okay. And Gallivant implied he might expose it, unless I backed a little campaign he had. What campaign? Something to do with the manor's property lines, the vicar said. He believed Lady Fenwick had encroached on public land decades ago, planted hedges where a footpath should be. He said he had proof. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a line. And, did you believe him? I believed he'd invent proof if none existed. It all aligned too well. Gallivant had cornered at least 3 people, Lady Fenwick, Harold Gubbins, and now the vicar, with suggestive threats, hints of evidence, and a promise of a scandal unless certain things went his way. But the note here had pictures introduced in new dimension. That evening, Miss Marple requested tea at the vicarage under the pretense of discussing a parish bake sale. As they sat in the modest study, she glanced briefly at the bookshelf near the fireplace, sold Bibles, dusty hymnals, and a slim gap between 2 encyclopedias. Do you keep your church records here? She asked. Reverend Ellis followed her gaze. Oh no, those are kept locked in the vestry. A tea. Then may I trouble you for something very particular? She said. Do you have a photo album? A photo album? He echoed. From the last summer fete, I believe. I recall you were quite proud of the children's choir and took many pictures. He hesitated only a second too long. I've misplaced it, he said. Or lent it to someone. She asked softly. No, he said after a pause. But now that you mention it, it was missing for several days. I found it back on my desk 3 mornings ago. I assumed I'd mislaid it. Miss Marple sipped her tea. It might be wise to check it again. One never knows what's been added or removed till one looks. He rose, left the room, and returned moments later with the album in hand. They sat side by side on the chintzes at tea and turned the pages together, children smiling with sticky faces, women in hats balancing teacups, Gallivant in the background of one photo, glowering near the lemon sponge, but near the end, slipped between the pages, was something unexpected, a small envelope. The vicar opened it. Inside were 4 photographs. Miss Marple peered over his shoulder. They showed the orchard, the old bench, a man and a woman sitting close to close. The man was unmistakably Harold Gubbins. The woman, young and sharply dressed, was not his wife. Oh dear, said the vicar. P-A-L-I-N-G. Miss Marple said nothing. She didn't need to. Gallivant had kept something, just as she'd expected. Not just threats. Proof, however petty. And someone had found those photos before the police had, which meant that someone had taken them, tasted them back, perhaps tried to cover the trail in blood. The question was no longer who had motive. It was who had access, and how long they could keep their hands clean. Chapter 8. The maid with the torn glove rained softly the next morning in Thistlebrook, the sort of drizzle that misted the windows and made hedges look greener than they had any right to be. The village itself seemed to retreat inward, as if even its cobblestones were reluctant to speak too loudly. But despite the weather, the mood was not one of peace. In parlors and kitchens, behind curtained shop windows and half-open doors, the question still lingered. Who had murdered Roger Gallivant? At the center of that silence, Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, spooning strawberry jam onto a scone that had gone slightly stale. The envelope from the previous morning lay beside her teacups, cryptic message still unfaded. She had shown it to no one, not even Inspector Lennox. Not yet. Timing was everything. She opened her notebook and glanced again at the names she'd written. Lady Fenwick, threatened over family scandal. Harold Gubbins, Orchard Affair, Reverend Ellis, irregular loan, Mr. Moorcroft, accidental witness. Clara, frightened, observant, silent. It was the last name that gave her pause. Clara had seen someone leaving the East Wing. She'd heard whispers in the house. She had noticed Gallivant's patterns, his guests, and possibly more than she realized. And now, with the photographs from the orchard surfacing, Miss Marple couldn't ignore a creeping suspicion that Clara Delicate, soft-spoken Clara might have been closer to the danger than anyone had yet understood. So, Miss Marple went to the manor again. Lady Fenwick, with a face like carved ivory and hands like curled paper, admitted her with a grimace. Honestly, Jane, you've been here more in the past week than in the last 10 years. I assume this is not about flower shows. I'm afraid not, Miss Marple said, removing her gloves. I was hoping to have a word with Clara. She's in the laundry room, Lady Fenwick said, sighing. I'd be gentle with her. She's been rather fragile, though I can't decide if it's nerves or guilt. Miss Marple raised her brow. Guilt? Oh, not murder, dear, said Lady Fenwick, waving one hand. But she did take a half day without asking last week. Said she had to go to the chemist, but I rather think she was sneaking off to see that boy from the butcher's. Ginger hair, smells of corned beef. Miss Marple suppressed a smile. I'll be gentle. She found Clara kneeling on the stone floor of the back laundry room, carefully folding linens into a wicker basket. Her face was pale, her motions mechanical. There was something slightly different about her today, a distance in her gaze, a weariness that seemed to go beyond grief or fear. I brought these, Miss Marple said, offering a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Lavender sachets. I find them calming. Clara stood slowly and accepted the parcel with a faint smile. Thank ma'am. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes catching a faint red mark on Clara's wrist, just beneath the cuff of her blouse. Not fresh, but recent enough. Working too hard, she asked, gesturing to the mark. Clara quickly pulled her sleeve down. Just caught it on the copper. Nothing serious. Miss Marple said nothing. Instead, she glanced down at the laundry pile and noticed something unusual and old. Torn glove tucked beneath the folded sheets. She reached gently toward it. Is this yours? Clara hesitated. Yes, I meant to mend it. Miss Marple turned it over. The index finger was ripped, the tear jagged, as if it had caught on something sharp, or stained. There were faint brown smudges along the inside. Miss Marple looked up. Clara's mouth opened, closed again. Please, the girl said in a whisper. Don't tell anyone. It's not what you think. What do I think, Clara? The girl sat down suddenly on a low wooden stool, clutching the parcel of lavender against her chest. I didn't kill him. I didn't say you did. But you saw the glove. Yes, Miss Marple said calmly, and I saw your wrist. I believe you've been frightened for a very long time. Clara nodded, eyes glistening. He said he had something that could ruin me. A photo from when I worked in Muchwood, before I came here. Miss Marple didn't speak, to let the girl continue. It was nothing awful, but I had a relationship with a man. Married. He said he'd leave her, but he didn't. When it ended, I left town. Thought it was over. But then Gallivant came here and said he had proof. A photo. And if I didn't do as he asked, he'd send it to Lady Fenwick. What did he ask of you? To bring him people's letters? Gossip? Anything useful? Said I was just collecting what was already open. So you did it. Clara's face crumpled. Only twice. Then I couldn't anymore. I told him I wouldn't. I said I'd rather be sacked than keep sneaking around. And then he threatened to go to Lady Fenwick the next morning. Said he'd already written everything down in case anything happened to him. Said if he died, others would still suffer. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. So did you go to see him? No, Clara said quickly. I wanted to, but I didn't. I went to the chemist to calm my nerves. That's when Lady Fenwick says I was missing. Did anyone see you? Clara paused. Mr. Moorcroft. He passed me on his walk. He tipped his hat, but didn't stop. Miss Marple considered this. He didn't mention it to the police. Think he forgets half of what he sees. But he might remember. Did you take the photographs? Clara shook her head. No, I didn't know where they were, but you suspected Gallivant had them. Yes. Miss Marple reached forward and took Clara's hand. You've been used, Clara. But it's not the first time Gallivant exploited someone. He made a game of it. Clara whispered. Then, who stopped the game? Miss Marple didn't answer. She stood, tucked the torn glove into her bag. Kent gave Clara a small smile. Sometimes, she said, the truth hides in the most ordinary corners. But it always wants to be found. As she left the manor, the rain had cleared, and the air smelled faintly of lilacs. Miss Marple did not yet know who had killed Roger Gallivant, but she now knew who hadn't, and that, in a mystery, was almost as good as knowing who had. Chapter 9. The Truth in a Teacup. The Storebrook never looked more innocent than it did that Tuesday morning. The clouds had dispersed overnight, leaving the village draped in soft sunlight. Honeybees resumed their lazy buzz over rosemary bushes, and a tabby cat lay sprawled on the low stone wall by the green, oblivious to murder, motives, and secrets. But Miss Marple, sipping her mid-morning tea, was neither drowsy nor idle. She was waiting. She had written 3 short letters the night before, each word measured, each phrase chosen not only for what it revealed, but for what it implied. 2 were still sealed in her side table drawer. The third had already done its job. She heard the knock at 10:13 a.m. precisely. Ah, she murmured, setting her cup down. Right on time. Spectre Lennox stood at the door, coat unbuttoned, brow furrowed. He was holding a handkerchief in one fist and looked thoroughly agitated. You sent this? He asked, producing the anonymous typed note Miss Marple had. Received. I did, she replied calmly. It came by post yesterday. I thought you ought to see it, but not immediately. I was more curious to see who else had seen it. Lennox stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Are you saying someone else knew you had this before I did? Oh yes, Miss Marple said, leading him into the parlor. I showed it to Clara. Why on earth? Because I wanted to know if she had sent it. She hadn't, but she recognized what it meant. Lennox sat down slowly. Pictures from the orchard. There in the vicar's photo album, Miss Marple said, pouring tea. Someone slipped them in after borrowing it briefly. I imagine the idea was to keep them hidden in plain sight. Fortunately, the person who planted them did not account for the vicar's absent-mindedness. He misplaced the album, entirely derailing their plan. Blackmail photos. Yes, Harold Gubbins and a woman not his wife. It's harmless to most, but damaging to a man who spent the last decade pretending to be reformed. Lennox rubbed his temples. Cod and Gallivant used that to control him, and the vicar, and Lady Fenwick, and Clara to a degree. He was collecting secrets like playing cards, Lennox muttered. He's trying to stack the deck. Miss Marple set the sugar bowl closer to him. He was clever, yes, but too clever. People like Gallivant always believe they're the only ones with a plan. They forget that desperation breeds improvisation. Lennox leaned forward. Then who killed him? It wasn't Clara, was it? No, Miss Marple said gently. She's many things, but not a killer. Nor would she have taken the risk of confronting him directly. Then who? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She poured another cup and stirred it slowly. The teaspoon clinked against the china in a quiet rhythm. The glove Clara dropped. She said at last, torn, stained. But the stain was old blood, not fresh. And the tear was not from a struggle, but from being caught on something sharp. I imagine she tore it near the laundry press a day or 2 earlier. But that leaves us nowhere. Not quite, she said. Think about the person who knew all the village routines, who could walk anywhere at any hour without suspicion, who had just enough flair for drama to make the discovery, but also a history of false alarms. Lennox sat up. Moorcroft. Marple nodded. He told you he found the body at 6:55, she continued. But Clara saw someone leave the east wing around 6:10. She assumed they were the same person. But they weren't. Moorcroft arrived later, realized what he'd stumbled upon, delayed raising the alarm. Lennox frowned. Why would he delay? He's always desperate for attention. Because he needed to be sure the man was dead. If Gallivant had only been injured, then Moorcroft might have been exposed. So he waited, made sure. Lennox stood abruptly. What, we've got no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no weapon. Tied to him, tossed the knife into the river, Miss Marple said. He admitted hearing the splash. But there's something else. She rose and walked to the sideboard, where a small tin sat half buried among biscuit boxes and napkins. From it, she produced a silver fountain pen. This, she said, was found beneath the hawthorn bush by Constable Rowntree. I asked him to let me examine it. It's engraved. She handed it to Lennox. He read aloud, P.M. for truth. Always, from E. Percival Moorcroft, Miss Marple said. Gift from his late wife, Eleanor. Known to everyone. He carries it with him daily. Yet, he hasn't noticed it missing. Lennox turned the pen over in his fingers. Could. Dropped it weeks ago. Possibly. But it had fresh soil under the cap when I opened it. The same sort of soil found beneath the hawthorn. Lennox swore under his breath. He confronted Gallivant. Yes, she said. I believe Gallivant tried to blackmail him too. Perhaps something old. Or perhaps Gallivant had seen Moorcroft, snooping eager to finally catch someone in the act, for real. Croft, with his endless tales and need for attention, realized that this time it would be him exposed, so he killed him with a kitchen knife, taken earlier from Lady Finnick's scullery. Then he made sure to appear shocked, performative, perfectly placed as the heroic discoverer. It was a role he'd rehearsed 100 times before. Lennox looked down at the pen again, then at Miss Marple. You want me to arrest him based on a pen? I want you to speak with Clara first, she said. She confirmed seeing Moorcroft on her way to the chemist after he claims to have found the body. That alone contradicts his timeline. Then show him the pen and mention the orchard. Lennox stared a moment longer, then gave a low chuckle. You know, when I first arrived in this village, I thought the hardest part of my job would be the sheep on the road. Miss Marple smiled. It's rarely the sheep you need worry about, Inspector. It's the ones in disguise. That afternoon, Percival Moorcroft was asked to visit the constabulary to clarify a few minor details. He went eagerly, confident that he was finally being treated with the seriousness he deserved. By tea time, he was no longer talking, and by nightfall, the village had its answer. Miss Marple didn't go to the pub that evening. She sat instead by her fireplace, knitting softly as the wireless played a waltz in the background. Outside, Thistlebrook exhaled quiet, as if afraid to shatter the peace too quickly. Inside, Miss Marple made a final note in her little book. The truth is never loud, she wrote, but it always waits to be heard. Chapter 10. What the Roses remembered it was Thursday in Thistlebrook, a day so perfectly ordinary it seemed to insist on forgetting that a murder had ever taken place. The roses in front gardens were beginning to bloom. The bell at St. Mildred's rang crisply on the hour, and the scent of scones drifted from Mrs. Trigg's kitchen window. The village, it seemed, was ready to move on. But Miss Marple knew better. Truth doesn't vanish with time. It simply softens its edges. And in a village like Thistlebrook, where time moved gently and secrets took root like ivy, even the gentlest, truth could crack stone eventually. She sat beneath the trellis in her garden that morning, and knitting lay beside her, and a letter from Inspector Lennox resting in her lap. It was short and politely worded, Moorcroft confessed, though only after being confronted with the pen and Clara's account. He claims it was not planned, that he only meant to scare Gallivant into silence, but fear and pride make poor companions. He brought the knife to the meeting. The rest, as they say, followed a script of his own writing. Miss Marple folded the letter with delicate precision. It confirmed what she had already pieced together, though not without some sorrow. Moorcroft had always longed to be the center of something important, and when the chance came, he could not resist seizing it, even at the price of a life. What made it all the more tragic was that Gallivant had no actual evidence against him. Like most of his manipulations, it had been bluff, a whisper, a shadow. But to a man like Moorcroft, already brittle with self-doubt and desperate for purpose, the threat was real enough. Just after 11, Clara arrived at Miss Marple's gate, carrying a small basket of violets. "I wanted to thank you," she said, voice shy but steady. I've been offered a position with Lady Rosamond in Much Wood. It's a clean start." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "You deserve one. I thought I'd never be free of it." "The fear," Clara said. But once you named it aloud, it began to vanish. "That's the way of many shadows," Miss Marple replied. "Todd, they cannot survive the light." Clara hesitated, then said, "Do you really think he'd have told anyone about my past?" Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "My dear, if you had told Lady Fenwick yourself, she likely would have clucked her tongue, said something about the reckless youth of today, and forgotten about it by breakfast." Clara smiled, truly smiled, and Miss Marple felt the weight lift from her shoulders. After Clara left, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village, nodding to shopkeepers and children and the postmistress, who had taken to wearing brighter lipstick ever since the excitement began. She stopped at the green, where the parish notice board now read, "Spring choir auditions. All welcome. No blackmail allowed." Okay? That last line, she suspected, was Reverend Ellis's dry humor. She paused by the Bridgemeal bridge where it had all begun. The water trickled beneath, calm and unhurried. The hawthorn bush where Gallivant's body had been found stood in full bloom now, as if determined to erase the memory with beauty. But the roses remembered, and so did Miss Marple. She looked out across the green and thought of how close the truth had come to being missed. If Clara had not confided, if the glove had not been torn, if the photograph had not slipped behind the wrong page in the vicar's album. So many small, delicate details. But murder was never grand in the way newspapers liked to write it. It was quiet, human, often born not of hatred, but of fear, humiliation, or some long-gnawed insecurity. Moorcroft hadn't meant to become a killer, but he had meant to silence someone. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was often where murder truly began, not in violence, but in the intention to silence by the end of the week. The manor had returned to its lazy rhythm, the village once again comforted by the familiar sounds of gossip and teacups. Gallivant's room had been emptied. A typewriter sold for £0.50. His presence, like his threats, had vanished, absorbed into the soil of Thistlebrook like so many stories before him. But in her parlor, beside a bowl of rose potpourri and her old notebook, Miss Marple made one last entry. People speak loudly when they want to be noticed, but it is the quiet ones who often see most clearly. Clara, the vicar, even the dead man. She closed the notebook gently, then, lifting her teacup once more, she smiled to no one in particular and said, as if offering a final toast to the vanished ghost of Roger Gallivant, "Too many wolves, dear sir." And finally, someone bit back,